Autopsy doctors of Reddit. What was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? Assisted with a post-mortem when I was a student. Female patient died in her 40s. Her medical history had extensive complaints of abdominal pains. One DR even referred to her as a hypochondriac and others commented on apparent anxiety. Opened her abdomen and she had extensive scar tissue. She was absolutely massacred inside from endometriosis. She suffered for decades and never got referred for a laparoscopy. She didn't have effing anxiety, she had a medical condition. When my parents were in medical school, they attended an autopsy of a patient who had died in a car accident. Autopsy revealed that apparently this guy had survived a chest shot in Vietnam years ago that the surgeon's medics left in rather than perform risky surgery. The accident had migrated the bullet to his heart and was ruled the cause of death. Not mine, but a doctor I used to work with. Back when he was in school, he would do his cadaver labs really late at night to many people during the day. One time it was really late, around 2 AM. He was listening to his lecture on his headphones and he saw the cadaver's arm move twitch. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he saw it again. Proceeded to run away in a panic. He told a few of his classmates what happened, but nobody believed him. Next day they had a group cadaver lab with the same cadaver. The arm twitched yet again. The professor did some digging and it turns out the patient's pacemaker was still fully functional and occasionally fired, causing the arm twitch. He was so relieved. He thought there was a zombie in there. The professor did some digging, literally. My friend once cremated a lady and when they pulled the table out there were 3 sets of forceps sitting there. Most likely she died in surgery, but I always thought it was crazy those were left in, and whatever metal they're made of clearly has a higher melting point than cremation temps. My friend had to do an autopsy on a baby. The dad claimed she died after rolling off a couch. My friend found that the kid was slammed against a hard surface multiple times. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. My friend had to quit that job cause it was so taxing mentally. Masters in forensic pathology here. You'd be surprised to know the number of people that have life-threatening issues that never went diagnosed and that they didn't die from. Seen an older guy who died of pneumonia in hospital. On autopsy the guy had both an enlarged heart and a couple of medium-sized aneurysms in the brain. Another guy in his 70s apparently came into the ER and had chest pain then died shortly after. Dies of a heart attack but also had cancer. In less natural circumstances though, saw a guy who had been shot in the head a couple of times. 3 definite entries and a blown out skull, but police only found 1 bullet. Couldn't find the other bullet in his head at all. Assumed the police missed it. Went on as normal with the autopsy until we got to the chest cavity. The other bullet was just chilling beside his lung. Turns out it entered the skull, hit the inside, ricocheted down his neck and into the chest. That was pretty wild. It's so wild to me how on the one side, humans can be so resilient and survive horrible things, and on the other side just how fragile and quick life can be taken from us. 2 very different extremes. Thanks for sharing your perspective. I'm a veterinarian and sometimes I do necropsy, basically autopsy for animals, and one of the more notable cases involved a prized Wagyu cow that died mysteriously. Wagyu cows are very expensive to rear and fetch a good price at the slaughterhouse. After cutting her open, I found metal wires extending from her stomach into her heart. It's what we call hardware disease. Apparently the cow decided that eating metal wires for constructing fences was a good idea. Normally the farm hands are quite good at keeping these hazards away from the inquisitive bovines, but I guess slip up do happen from time to time. My wife is a pathologist assistant and during her schooling carried out the autopsy of a newborn that died minutes after birth. The mother was desperate for a child and had a history of multiple miscarriages at different terms. This was her first time making it full term and all prenatal checkups revealed no problems. The delivery was difficult, but successful, and baby was alive for a short time. Skip to autopsy. All signs point to baby being fully developed. Get to the abdominal cavity and the liver is lacerated and hemorrhage everywhere. During the difficult delivery the resident used too much force with the forceps to pull the baby out. The ruptured liver that caused the baby to bleed out internally. Wife was enthusiastic about autopsy up to this point. Now has no interest. Sheep farmer. I have to know how to do a necropsy for when something dies to know if it's something that could spread. Had a you fall over dead after losing a ton of weight, and after treating her for everything under the sun, she would gasp for air and struggle to breathe, but antibiotics, steroids and anti-inflammatory drugs didn't touch it. She finally passed away and I cut her open to see what the hell happened, fully expecting to see her lungs riddled with sh. Her heart was 5 times the normal size and hard as a river stone. My guess is she'd had that issue her whole life and it didn't kill her until she was 2. My dad used to perform autopsies. His best story was that they were brought a body that has no real indication of any issues. After examining the body, the only thing of note was that there was blood coming out of the guy's rectum. They begin the autopsy and the guy's organs are completely liquefied and the body cavity is filled with lead shot. It became apparent really quickly that someone had shoved a shotgun up his A and pulled the trigger. This was in the 70s and I still have to wonder what this guy did to piss someone off enough to get a shotgun up his A. This story circulates every year at my medical school. A body came in with a gunshot wound to the chest. There was no exit wound. They tried to locate the bullet during the autopsy. No success. They then did a whole scan, X-ray or CT, of the upper chest, abdomen, pelvis. No bullet at that point. Someone said F it, let's scan the whole body. Lo and behold, the bullet was detected in the popliteal fossa, area behind the knee. It had embolized, traveled from the heart all the way down the arterial system to the knee where it got stuck in one of the narrower blood vessels. Training in the medical examiner's office. Elderly woman found dead by herself in her home. There was nothing suspicious, so I was given the case. Took out all the organs. Dissected everything. Completely unremarkable. I cut through the larynx as the last step before I could clean up and finish the case, and boom. Giant piece of chicken lodged in her windpipe. Died choking on dinner. I'm single and happy being single. And honestly I think about that scenario too often. Choking on my food. Dying alone in my apartment. My cat eating my face. I did the autopsy of both a robber and his victim. The robber shot the victim in the back when he tried to escape in a motorcycle. And the robber was shot by the police in the exact same situation. What's interesting is that they both died by exactly the same lesion. Both of them had their 4th lumbar vertebra shattered and their aorta, main artery of the body, sectioned at the same level. I thought of it like an extreme example of instant karma. In college I took a figure drawing class and the teacher was adamant that you couldn't draw the figure if you didn't know what was in it, so he dragged us over to the anatomy lab and had the anatomy teacher show us two cadavers that were being dissected by their med students. When it came time to ask questions, of course, have you ever found something weird in a body, came up. The story is as follows. They get a body, and for legal reasons they aren't told much about the person aside from medical history. They were told that the old man was a sort of rock star type and was a one-hit wonder from his youth, and to use extra discretion with him, in particular not tell the students who might recognize him. The lab is full of 20-year-olds and so nobody recognized who he was. Unsure if the teacher even knew, but it didn't sound like she did, or what his deal was, so they wrote it off as non-useful information aside from his lifestyle. He had drug use and alcohol issues in his life and they were told he partied a lot. Cool. The body has a raging boner, like 100% of the time. Teacher doesn't think much of it aside from that he was particular endowed, and everybody wrote it off as not important to their studies. So they go through the general dissection that they do. One kid wants extra credit and the teacher said sure. Dissect his penis, see why it's hard still, and write a report. Apparently they don't normally do that for that particular class, so the penis itself goes untouched from their dissection, so it would have otherwise always been a mystery. Kid finds an actual rod that he had medically inserted under the table, not in medical records, so that he would always have a boner and could get it up while on drugs. They suspect it was done over 30-40 years prior to his death. They removed it and keep it in the lab, I believe, to show their students as part of a section on under the table medical surgeries. Anyways, that was probably the best day in figure drawing class I've ever had. I worked at a coroner's office for a while, and once we had a guy who we thought had died from an OD on meth. Well, we started the autopsy and I went to cut his lungs out and blueberry muffin mix started coming out of them. I stuck my finger in his mouth and it was full of blueberry muffin mix. And it was in throat. Turns out he got just high enough to pass out while eating the muffin mix and he ended up choking to death. I am a pre-med student, and one time while shadowing a forensic pathologist, 3 days before Christmas, he was doing an autopsy on an automobile vs pedestrian accident. The man's face was completely smashed in. When they take samples of the brain, they cut the skin, pull it over the face, and they cut off the top of the skull. When they did that, the skull was basically shattered and bone fragments pulled back with the skin, and when they cut off the skull cap, the brain was obviously damaged and the eyeballs had been pushed back, fallen through the orbits and into the cranial cavity. The guy also had $10,000 in cash in his shin pockets. According to police, he had a record involving drugs, so the theory was either a drug deal gone bad or he stumbled into the road while under the influence. Not a doctor, but a whole body scientific donation technician. I'm the person who dissects cadavers after they were donated. We very commonly would get young cases, normally overdoses. Had a mid-30s female, went to medical examiner prior to donation, but they only did an external evaluation. I went to check her genitals to see if I could palpate a uterus. Found a condom full of pills. Similar to most, the body became a crime scene and we couldn't touch her. When we finally were able to continue, they asked us to photograph the pills to send to the examiner's office. They were mostly Advil and Zyrtec. Easily one of the weirdest things I've ever found. Forensic pathologist here. To come to mind, I had just moved back to my home state where family lives. Get a case with a man with a distinctive last name in the family tree. I put a text out to my mom to see if we were related, but before she texted back I pulled the sheet back and already knew. He looked like me. It was my great uncle. Get a case where it's a house fire death. On exam he's got multiple textbook stab and sized wounds. I spend the next 30 minutes getting gaslighted, quizzed by PD about "Are you sure?" because they thought this was a straightforward house fire. Unfun fact: fire's not an uncommon way for people to try to conceal a homicide. During my internship rotation a couple of years back, a 40-year-old guy came in because he suddenly collapsed while drinking with friends. He came in unresponsive, mouth bleeding, and not breathing, so we had to intubate him. For some reason, the endotracheal tube, the stiff tube placed inside the trachea to help the patient breathe, won't go in, but we managed to suction copious amounts of blood clots after CPR, still with unsuccessful intubation, so we had to bag him with a face mask. The patient was declared dead and diagnosed with a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. During the autopsy, they found out that the guy was apparently shot by a gun from the top of the head. The entry wound was obscured by his hair and was barely bleeding at all, and the bullet somehow went through the back of the guy's throat and made a hole behind the base of the tongue, which the endotracheal tube kept slipping into. My grandmother had a massive stroke in her 30s that paralyzed her entire left side, and died in her 60s from a heart attack. But while doing the autopsy they found out she had bad lung cancer, but she never had any pain from it because it was in her left lung. She was a very heavy smoker, so it made sense. It's just crazy that she had lung cancer and never knew. Late to the thread, so this will probably get buried. Disclaimer: I am a doctor, but not an autopsy doctor, and had never really considered pathology as a specialty when I was in medical school. This event happened in anatomy lab when I was in medical school. In the preclinical years of medical school, most medical schools have students enroll in anatomy lab where we dissect cadavers as part of the course. One of the anatomy labs had a cadaver who had passed away from complications from kidney failure, according to the identification tab. While that anatomy team was dissecting some of the leg and buttock muscles, they found a bullet in the gluteus medius. No idea how it got there and totally unrelated to the cause of death. I like to imagine the guy signing paperwork to donate his body to science, thinking that the med students dissecting his butt would get a funny surprise. Medical examiner here. This probably isn't a big wow revelation, but it certainly made an impact on me. Very early in my career, I did an exam on another doctor who worked at the hospital where I trained. I didn't know this gentleman personally but was acquainted with him by reputation. He was a very happy-go-lucky sort, much loved by everyone in his department. He died unexpectedly at a young age of what turned out to be a drug overdose on pharmaceuticals he had been diverting from the hospital. I don't think anybody saw that coming, myself included. It was a lesson to me that anybody can fall victim to addiction, and that it's hard to know what anybody's private struggles are. Not an autopsy doctor, but did take anatomy and physiology II with lab in college. The lab was working on cadavers being prosected by more advanced students. A prosection is the dissection of a cadaver, human or animal, or part of a cadaver by an experienced anatomist in order to demonstrate for students anatomic structure. Anyway, one of the cadavers, we had a male and a female for obvious reasons, was a big ol' linebacker looking dude, like, and older bodybuilder type. I think his age at time of death was late 50s. His heart has been removed by the anatomist, and we were examining it because it was very enlarged and contributed to his death. We all had to hold it in our hands to feel the heft, like size and weight, and compare it to the heft of the female's heart, which was normal sized, about like a large apple. The male's heart, for comparison, was the size of a small cantaloupe. I went first, for whatever reason, and the instructor lifted the enlarged heart out of its preservative bath and placed it in my hands. I damn near dropped the thing when it shocked me with what felt like a jolt of electricity. I, understandably, I think, made a startled noise, and the instructor took the heart back before I could juggle it onto the floor. "Oh," she said, "I forgot to warn you. Look out for the pacemaker." Apparently when someone has a pacemaker there's a battery too, and they don't bother taking it out of. They just snip the leads and leave it there. So if you touch both bare leads you get a mild shock, even through your exam gloves. That was a mildly disturbing experience.